Dracula, the Countess of Blood, the first female serial killer. These are just a few of the names that Elisabeth Bathory has been given over time. So tonight, we're going to talk about the legend and the lore behind the Countess Elisabeth Bathory. And you can decide whether or not these things are true or if these things have been greatly exaggerated. So sit back and relax and enjoy another story time. I'm sure you guys have all heard the incredible tale of Elisabeth Bathory. She was known for the disappearance of over 600 women in the villages that she owned. Some of the legends say that she drank their blood and that she bathed in their blood to gain youth, that she had numerous torture chambers in every single one of her estates, and that she did it for power and for vanity, for hypersexuality, and that she was a sexual sadist. But what do we really know about Elisabeth Bathory? So I thought we'd start from the very beginning and give you a little history on who she was and where she came from. So Elisabeth Bathory was born on May 15th, May 8th in 1575 to a notable family. Her father was Baron George Bathory. Her uncle was Andrew Bathory, and he was a high-ranking official in Hungary. And he actually held the highest rank in Transylvania. Her mother was Anna Bathory, and her grandfather was also a high-ranking official in Transylvania. Her great-uncle was the King of Poland. He was a Grand Duke of Lithuania and the Prince to Transylvania. She also had an older brother named Stephen, and he became a royal judge in Hungary. As a child, she suffered from multiple seizures and epilepsy. The train of thought was that it was due to possible inbreeding from her parents, as they were related. However, looking back at a little bit of research and information, that turns out to be that they were actually separated by 7 generations from common ancestors. So actually, they were 200 years apart as far as distant relatives go. The treatment back then for epilepsy and seizures were to rub the blood from a human, healthy person that didn't have anything wrong with them, and you would rub the blood of them on your lips, and you would drink it, or you could mix a little bit of healthy blood with a ground up skull of a healthy person and drink that, and that would actually help with seizures and epilepsy. And one of the theories is that that could be a possible reason for the later killings that supposedly transpired much later in her life. At 15, she married her husband on May 8th of 1575, and he goes off to war in 1578. And while he's away, she manages their business affairs, takes care of all of their estates, along with any type of medical care that was needed. Between 1593 and 1606, there was a long war, and during that time, she would intervene on the behalf of destitute women, women who had lost their husbands and were captured. And there's some references that she had helped a woman whose daughter had been raped and impregnated from that attack. So she really stood by and was the keeper of women and tried and helped all of the people and all of the women in the villages whose husbands were away or injured. She would go on to have several children. She had a daughter in 1585, another daughter in 1590, another daughter in 1594. She had a son in 1596 and another son in 1598. And there's a possibility of another child, possibly a boy, that had died either in childbirth or at a very young age. So at 48, her husband dies from some sort of unknown illness. In 1601, it started out with him having severe leg pain, and by 1603, he was permanently disabled. He passes away after 29 years of marriage, and he left his heirs and his widow in the charge. This man's name was Gregory Thurzo, and he had a huge political agenda. And after he was left in charge of Bathory, her sadistic behavior became worse, supposedly, allegedly. And it's said that she would torture and maim over 400 different girls that were left in her care as servants. When she was done with them, they were said to be thrown over the castle walls and fed to the wolves. Whether or not this is true, there's no proof of that. It's just sort of word of mouth. However, with that many girls that have gone missing, the tactic then became luring girls from different villages into her castle so that she could have her way with them. Again, none of this is proven. It's sort of just a folklore and word of mouth. Now, some would explain her sadistic behavior as a symptom of mental illness that resulted from genetic defects due to inbreeding, which we've already talked about are absolutely not true because, like we said before, her parents were separated by many, many generations before the marriage. And like I said, there's a 200-year distance between the husband and the wife. So for them to say that she had a mental illness due to inbreeding probably wasn't true. Now, during this time, there was a huge religious uprising. Her family was predominantly Protestant to the up-and-coming Catholic Church that was trying to take over everyone's land. The area of Transylvania had always been separate and was under their own rule. So they had their own government, and they were not succumbing to anyone's dictatorship of telling them who or what religious background the kingdom needed to become. So after her husband died, she became the most wealthiest landowner and authority in Transylvania at that time. Now, Thurzo wanted to become one of the most powerful men in Hungary. So his greatest opponent and biggest obstacle was the Bathory family, which was held and headed by Elisabeth. In 1729, at the height of the Counter-Reformation, a Hungarian priest wrote a cautionary fable about Elisabeth Bathory with the purpose of exposing horrors of the Protestant Reformation. And he just happened to be in the back pocket of Thurzo. However, in this Jesuit priest's writing, he got it wrong and had said that she was a renegade Catholic who had become murderous following her conversion to Lutheranism, when in fact, her entire family were lifelong Calvinists, and they had never adopted, I guess, her husband's Lutheran faith. So based on 130 years of widespread gossip and folk mythology and pieces of religious propaganda that were the basis of what was to become the horror story of Elisabeth Bathory. So according to his story, Elisabeth Bathory not only bathed in the blood of her servants and these unwilling girls, she did it to preserve her youth, but she also succumbed to her sadistic nature and pleasure in murdering and torturing these servant girls. And also, this Jesuit priest claims that Thurzo caught the Countess in the act of murder. There was an investigation, and it was long and it was painstaking, and it failed to turn up any evidence to prove that she had done anything wrong or that she was taking the lives of hundreds of different girls. It did, however, show signs of becoming a show trial, sort of a propaganda piece, and maybe the very first fake news. So, with forged evidence and false rumors and the use of horror stories to intimidate and manipulate different witnesses, Elisabeth Bathory was arrested, imprisoned without any formal charges, any formal summons, a formal trial, or any formal sentencing. Thurzo says that the reason all of this happened and the reason that she was arrested without any formal charges or a trial or any sentencing was because he, being the good guy that he is, wanted to save the family's reputation and their wealth and Elisabeth's life by preempting a death sentence. But we could probably call his motives into question as a rumor campaign to create all these trumped up charges, as well as his ability to construct forged evidence against her. Some of the allegations that were investigated were very selective, and they were sort of a nationwide rumor campaign against Elisabeth Bathory, stating that she maintained torture chambers in every single one of her estates, which there were 7 different estates that she owned, and that she had even taken girls on her travels in order to torture them and kill her. However, the investigation had been contained to Western Hungary, which is the only property that Thurzo's personal sphere of influence through his friends and family and relatives that he had ownership of. So the areas that were in question were all run by him. So when he picked witnesses for these rumors that would eventually testify against her, they were taken and they were inundated with all of the rumors and all of the information of the alleged crimes, so that by the time they did testify, they would be very familiar with the stories of her murders and her torture. So among the 300 people that would testify, there were no actual victims who had been hurt, and there were no eyewitnesses that had actually seen any of these events. And if they really were true witnesses, though that testimony would have been invaluable for her prosecution, but these witnesses who did learn about the crimes had only learned about it through word of mouth. And each time one of these victims testified about the several hundreds of victims, they could never get the amount of people or the amount of victims correct. However, Elisabeth's alleged partners in crime, who had all been tortured several times before testifying against her, could only come up with a total of 36 victims. So let's talk about the victims. Okay, so back in her day, it was common for landowners to provide health care to their tenants and to their servants. The care of men who were wounded in war, who fell, had different accidents. Maybe they were officers of the court and they needed to be cared for by women and the children. That was part of a lady's duty at the time. They were sometimes aided by local midwives. And in some of her surviving letters, it describes the manner in which she managed her business affairs of her household and numerous different estates. Now remember, there's 7 estates that she owned. So there were several instances of her petitioning the king on behalf of her tenants in legal or financial trouble. She had organized healing activities in her court in a similarly rational and compassionate way. Each of her estates had resident herbalists and healers who cared for the local tenants and servants, and she had a small personal staff of servants who were very well versed in the art of healing. They were high trained, and they were originally had cared for her children. So she hired local healers who were trained to diagnose different illnesses and injuries, so that while traveling in different villages, they could bring back to the castle those in need of more serious treatments than the typical household remedies. So if you were a noblewoman of that generation, of the Bathory generation, you had to be familiar with basic healing techniques so that you could manage the health care of the people who were living on their estates. She had the knowledge of different healing methods, patient care, herbal medicines that were based on Transylvania healing practices that she had learned from her own mom and from the healing women of her mom's generation. A lot of the practices were with herbs, of course. That were unique to Transylvania and to Eastern Hungary, but they would not be recognized in other countries. When she did bring foreign medical practitioners from Western Hungary in, some people found her methods a little bit strange and mysterious and maybe sometimes suspicious. But if one of these healing methods would not succeed in curing a patient, its unfamiliarity was seen as the reason that it failed. Also, the healing activity that was going on at one of her castles was looked at as highly suspicious because it involved a Croatian midwife and healer. And she was an outsider whose healing culture was completely different and alien to the locals. But the midwife had likely joined Elisabeth's personal staff so that women patients who had been or who didn't need to be treated or were uncomfortable being treated by a male assistant doctor, which they called barbers back then. And this midwife's specialty was surgical intervention, and apparently it requires a kind of physical skills like bloodletting. And that can be easily looked at as debauchery and or torture. So the idea of a midwife performing surgery, an activity that was specifically reserved for male doctors or for their male barber at that time, made the locals a little bit leery and a little bit aroused suspicion as to maybe they were practicing black magic. So, it's no coincidence that her healing methods would stir up a little bit of controversy and would later lead witnesses to testify that Elisabeth and her midwife were witches. There were huge superstitions and superstitious beliefs that originated from the rumors labeling the midwife and her surgical practices as torture that gave Thurzo the ability to add fuel to the fire for his smear campaign, which basically was accusing Elisabeth Bathory of murder and torture, because the villagers were terrified that they would meet with divine punishment should they accept the witches' foreign healing practices. So all of those things sort of led to this persecution of this woman by a man who really just wanted her wealth and her land. And what a better time and what a better position for him to be able to put her in by calling her a witch. The other really interesting thing is that the surgical techniques and the practices that this midwife was doing on different villagers that were injured, that Elisabeth as well took part in, whether she was helping or just overseeing, whatever it was. Those practices were recommendations from other doctors in Transylvania at the time. However, that was overlooked because it was done by women. So Elisabeth Bathory had a lot of letters that contained instructions for managing daily life and finances of her estate, as well as the medical service that she provided and that her staff provided, that was extremely useful during the time when an epidemic would hit. So in many ways, the service was better organized and it was a more sensible method than the most common healthcare practices of the day, because Elisabeth was assertive and she was rational and she had a method of organization with activities across her estates that were considered masculine and a little bit alien compared to the customs of her time, because she was so forward-thinking and so meticulous with her planning. So it's probably likely that Thurzo had used these unfamiliar medical practices to create trumped-up charges and construct a false narrative and evidence against the Countess. A lot of the practices described by the witnesses in their testimony can be recognized as painful and surgical and medical procedures. However, they are identified in the medical books during that time, and the conditions of the victims corresponds with some of the symptoms of various diseases, and the recorded deaths they do coincide with documented epidemics that were going on during that time, and medical texts of the time described extremely painful procedures for the treatments of boils and abscess and the removal of tissue and maggot wounds, open wounds that needed to be cauterized, infected tissue, and treatments with cupping and blisters and how to clean those out, how to treat high fevers that were induced with sweating and alternating cold and hot baths, applying tourniquets to limbs and other extremely painful practices that were believed to remove poisons that were thought to cause some of these different illnesses. Rheumatoidism and arthritis were often treated with rolling the patient's whole body over in stinging nettle, which is called fingernail poison, which was a common problem apparently for seamstresses. And treating boils and cleaning them out, lancing them, bloodletting, that was another big thing. That means opening the vein found on the underside of the tongue for smallpox. The bubonic plague was prevalent then, and they were all treated with different type of things like bricks that were used, and they were heated to be used as a heat compress. But I guess the bubonic plague victims, the medical treatment was very torturous, although one of the symptoms of the plague was overwhelming drowsiness, and doctors couldn't allow them to fall asleep. So all of these different diseases and illnesses and injuries that were going on back then in the 1500s were obviously life-threatening, but the treatment of them were probably a little bit worse, but you would either survive it or you wouldn't, because the sanitation wasn't obviously is not as good as it is today. However, if you walk into one of Elisabeth Bathory's rooms that she had set up for all of the healing and all of the medical treatment that was going on for the villagers, it could look like a torture chamber. Because in essence, it's not a torture chamber for all intents and purposes, but literally, if you are suffering from any of those things, going in there is torture. Now, one of the noted recorded deaths that occurred in one of her estates was well documented, and it had to do with the local outbreaks of the bubonic plague and typhus. So on October 1610, 8 young women died in the course of a week, all showing symptoms of the epidemic disease. Their deaths would absolutely be used by Thurzo as an excuse to arrest the Countess without any formal charges. So Elisabeth was traveling with her daughter and her personal staff during that week, and she was nowhere near the castle where the deaths had occurred. However, the 6 girls had been quarantined to prevent the spread of their disease, cared for by the midwife and a manservant. And these two, the manservant and the midwife, were among her personal servants who would later become tortured and executed as partners in her crimes that she allegedly committed. So when she returned to the castle, Thurzo made some fast-traveling rumors and refused to notify her of the deaths. And so she ended up concealing the bodies in different spots of the estate, hiding some of them in grottos of the castle garden and burying the others in the earth of the castle yard. And then later that month, Elisabeth found out the midwife's secret. So the midwife is the one that buried these women. And apparently they are calling it a grotesque and horrifying, scandalous manner when one of the dogs dug one of the bodies up. So, when the deaths reached Thurzo, it was the perfect opportunity for him to plan and arrest Bathory. So there's some surviving letters and some witnesses' accounts that describe the planning and organization that preceded the arrest. And one of them was written by Thurzo's wife, who gives an account of recruiting and selecting false witnesses to testify against the Countess. In another letter, Elisabeth Bathory's own son-in-law agrees to send his servants to the castle to help orchestrate Thurzo's surprise visit. So when Thurzo does arrive and meets the Countess, he accuses her of many, many acts of murder. And according to Thurzo's own clerk, Bathory was arrested while partaking of her supper. And she was arrested. So on the day of her arrest, a young woman who was severely injured by a wild animal was being cared for at the castle. Her treatment would be later completed by one of the local doctors, and she recovers completely and fully from her injuries. But Thurzo had said she was a victim of Countess Bathory's cruelty in her testimony, and that would be the best evidence to prove that she was guilty. However, this young lady's testimony is not included in the massive stacks of witness accounts related to her case. Most likely, it was omitted because her account would have described Elisabeth's healing services, not the torture and murder that she was being accused of. Following her arrest, her personal servants were interrogated with a set of pre-written questions, and her servants were subjected to extreme torture as well as the standard interrogation. And records also indicate that the interrogation show the latter of the allegation, and that no one was caught in the act of murder or torture, and there were no fresh bodies found at the castle like he had claimed. The arrest and her interrogation were completely and solely based on the 8 diseased bodies that were dug up on her property. And in October of 1610, Thurzo had intended to build a case of mass murder against the Countess and her servants. But since such a case would have called for actual physical evidence to stand up in court, the interrogation's main purpose was to find these 8 bodies on the estate. So, while Elisabeth's servants were being tortured, the only information asked of them was the location of the corpses. So one body was found buried in the castle yard, and that body was in fairly good condition because it was autumn and the cold weather had made the earth pretty damp, which preserved the body, and it looked like a fresh enough corpse that he could make it look like she had killed one of these girls and caught her in the act of murder. So the next day, when the body was taken into custody, he decided that he was going to let the body be viewed, and the injured patient was going to be called the newest victim of the Countess and her servants. So by then, the corpse was about 2 months old, and it was not in a suitable condition to be moved or inspected close up. So Thurzo's men laid the body out on a makeshift platform and carried the body to the castle yard, where onlookers were allowed to look at the body from a distance. Now, from a distance, with an untrained eye, it sort of looked like the body had partially healed injuries and that the patient did have signs of torture. So Elisabeth was forced to view the body in front of everyone and informed that her victims were now identified, and the Countess was publicly humiliated, and it shocked her tenants and servants into believing she really did commit these crimes. So the initial belief was nurtured for several months by Thurzo's rumor campaign in order to manipulate witnesses into thinking they had really seen the Countess caught in the act of murder, when the witness had only really been viewing what was basically a theatrical viewing of the body, and heard the crimes word of mouth, and ended up testifying to torture and murder. So during her trial, the Countess was never permitted to speak for herself, and no one was allowed to testify on her behalf because of the torturous and the interrogations. All but one of Elisabeth's personal servants were executed. She ended up being imprisoned for life, and she would survive the day of her arrest only by 4 years. So she died on August 21st of 1614. And according to records, she was found dead in the morning. They had said she'd been praying diligently and singing hymns. And the only other thing that strikes me odd is that she was never on trial for witchcraft. And all of her records were sealed for 100 years after her death. So the tale of Elisabeth Bathory and all of the crazy stories that we've heard about her, and her being the very first prolific serial killer of the 1500s, or that she was Lady Dracula, or she was the Bloody Countess, makes me wonder if this was just another situation of a woman who took healing and the art of making people well, and another man that wants to steal her land, call her a witch, and accuse her of many, many horrible acts to sully her name to get what they wanted from her, and they did. So thank you guys for taking a listen tonight, and maybe you'll think of Elisabeth Bathory in not such a harsh light the next time you hear about the Bloody Countess.